All right, I'm getting the thumbs up that we are good to go. Okay, great. Hi, everyone. I'm Hope Dector. I'm the creative director at the Barnard Center for Research on Women. I'm excited to welcome you all to this online conversation, Transformative Justice in the Era of Defund Police, Lessons from the Past, Strategizing for the Future, featuring Shira Hassan and Mimi Kim. I wanted to start with a couple of notes on accessibility for today's event. We are currently working on the live captioning for the event. Our live captioner had a family emergency, and so we have a new live captioner, Sarah, who is getting set up as we get started, and we will post the link to the live captions below the video description in YouTube and also on the event page as soon as it's available. And we apologize for the delay with the live captioning. A huge thank you to our ASL interpreters for today's event, Brandon and Carly. We'll be keeping the video in gallery mode so that you'll be able to see Brandon or Carly as the conversation goes on. The event is scheduled to take place for 2 hours, and we're planning to take a 5 to 10 minute break about an hour and 15 minutes into the event, so that when we come back from the Q&A, when we come back from the break, we'll be ready to start the Q&A. This conversation is part of the Building Accountable Communities project, which promotes non-punitive responses to harm by developing resources for transformative justice practitioners and organizing convenings and workshops that educate the public. Building Accountable Communities was conceived by Mariame Kaba and is a collaboration between BCRW and Project NIA. You can find links to previous online events and videos from the series on the event page. I have a few quick notes of thanks and information that might be helpful for viewers before we start the conversation. First, thank you to Mariame Kaba for creating this project and for sharing your abolitionist brilliance with the world in so many ways every day. Thanks also to Dean Spade for sharing your thoughts and insights while collaborating on these videos with Mariame and me. Thank you to all my coworkers at BCRW for making these events possible, including Elizabeth Castelli, Pam Phillips, Tammy Navarro, Avi Cummings, and especially Eve Kausch, who is coordinating so much of the work that goes into this event behind the scenes, including managing the social media and communications during the event. And also to BCRW student research assistant, Asha Fetterman, who is working with Eve behind the scenes today. If you have a question for Shira and Mimi, you can ask in the chat on the YouTube live page or by tweeting at BCRW tweets or emailing bcrw@barnard.edu. As we mentioned in the event description, today's event takes as its starting point 3 new videos in the Building Accountable Communities series, which feature transformative justice practitioners sharing their wisdom and insights from years of experience. One thing that came up in many of the interviews we did for this series was the need for people to keep trying things and sharing what worked and what didn't as part of the organic process of growth of transformative justice practices. With that in mind, I feel very lucky to get to hear from Shira Hassan and Mimi Kim today. Shira and Mimi are both longtime anti-violence organizers with decades of experience with harm reduction and responding to violence without policing. You can find their full bios on the event page, so I don't want to take up time away from their conversation to read them here. But I did want to mention as sort of essential reading in Transformative Justice 2 amazing resources that they've contributed. Shira Hassan co-wrote with Mariame Kaba, Fumbling Towards Repair, a workbook for community accountability facilitators. And you can find a link to that on the event page. And Mimi worked on the Creative Interventions Toolkit, which is fundamental reading for transformative justice practices. So with that, I want to turn it over to Shira and Mimi, and thank you both so much for being here.
Thank you, Hope.
Thank you. That was great. Thanks, Hope. We just want to echo all those thanks. We want to thank also the interpreters and the people working on live captioning to make this event as accessible as possible. And we want to, of course, thank Mariame, Project NIA, and BCRW for all of their incredible support, and Hope for your introductions and like this unbelievably smooth tech that we're experiencing right now. So thank you so much. I think we also want to make sure that we thank our broader TJ community and the women and queers that we've been growing and thinking with over the last 25 years. A lot of what we're going to share today has been done in collective. And what at least one of my most important learnings has been over the last 20 years that you can't practice TJ in a vacuum, and your interventions are so much better when you're practicing with people who are also practicing to learn and grow. So, Mimi?
Yes. Thank you. Thanks for joining this conversation. I agree. It's very rare, fortunately, that we have this much time live to talk. When I saw that this wasn't going to be reduced to a 3-minute clip, which I thought at first, but was actually going to be 2 hours for us to have a conversation, that's both terrifying, I have to admit, but also an opportunity for us to really spend time and go a little bit more slowly. I think a lot of times now that we've been asked to do more and more webinars and other public speaking, we're often constrained to do something within a 5-minute or a 7-minute little span of time, trying to think about what we want to get in. And this allows for some spaciousness. We hope that we're able to offer something that maybe you haven't heard before, or a way to synthesize things. I think for us, and just even preparing for this, it allowed me to go and really remember all of the people in the community that have been with us from before, still today, and all those that are so that I'm co-learning with, who I know are going to be the new leaders of the future. So we'll have time to mention some of those people. Not all of them will be mentioned. We'll miss people, but I know that I'm looking forward to being able to really give honor to some of the people, so many of you who have been part of this journey together.
Thanks, Mimi. So what we're hoping to talk about today we want to talk about interventions. We're going to talk about our mistakes, like some of our first ones, some of our failed ones, and some ones that we're seeing right now that are really successful. We're also going to talk a little bit about the history of TJ, our personal history, and how it evolved, and how we got to the work now. And we're going to talk a bit about like current dilemmas and tensions that are coming from the incredible groundswell around defund that has brought all these kinds of new questions around scale and capacity, and how to work parallel to the state, outside the state altogether, or like what non-reformist reform looks like, and things like that. So we want to, before we like dive too much further, we want to talk a little bit just to make sure we're all working with the same definitions. And we want to talk a little bit about the differences between transformative justice and restorative justice. And then we want to talk for a minute about carceral feminism versus abolition feminism. And so we want to just set the stage for those things. And then we're going to give like examples and get deeper once we have that. So I'll start, and I'm going to use a really simplistic definition for all of these things. And I'm going to start with the definition for transformative justice. And this is like the Young Women's Empowerment Project definition that for me has made the most sense over time. Transformative justice is a way of interrupting and transforming violence while addressing the root causes, so that everyone has a right to heal and everyone has a right to confront systems as they get in their way. And so TJ for us is any solution or intervention that happens outside the state. And the critical part is that it has to happen outside the state it should address the interpersonal thing that happened between the two or more people. And it should also address the root causes of what created that problem to begin with. Mimi, do you want to go every other?
Are you going to keep going with your definition of restorative justice?
Do you want me to do RJ? I could do that.
I mean, I could maybe I could add a little bit to the
Yeah.
justice, and that is in doing this. There's no transformative justice, restorative justice dictionary, that, or the encyclopedia of it doesn't exist. So a lot of this is like living language, and I think that what we've found. Sure, I haven't talked to you that much about this directly, but I know that this comment has come up that some of us do have different definitions or different, and it probably reflects a different entry point into actually starting to use the language. So I know for me, it's somewhat recent that I more fully embraced the language of transformative justice because I had really come into this using the language of community accountability. So some of this is thinking about some of the resistance I had to the justice language because justice had been so embedded in the criminal legal system that it seemed like when we were starting to do this contemporary work, 2000 and beyond, it just seemed so fraught to even be able to say justice. And it seemed like I saw so much how people immediately thought of the criminal justice system. And that might be some of my storytelling that I do at the beginning, was that so many of us who even those of us who were opposed to using the criminal justice system often replicated some of the same kinds of language, concepts, tactics, strategies, values in the kinds of interventions that we were trying to do that were alternative to or challenging carceral types of logics, carceral kinds of strategies. So in part, I know that I avoided using the language of transformative justice. I wasn't opposed to it. I was just more uncomfortable using community accountability to emphasize the community as the space in which we were doing this work, community as the folks that we're accountable to. And I know community can mean a lot of different things, and we could get into that as well. But it seemed a little bit more modest in its language and what we were trying to do, because we were just doing this on the ground. And we had, I think, our politics in place, but a lot of times we were grappling things that were pretty close to the ground, pretty nitty gritty, pretty much, in the community that as we understood community at the time. So it's more recently, I think, in that transformative justice has become so more widely embraced by people. It's been, and it's definitely has its detractors on all sides. So I understand that as well coming into this conversation. But it is something that has become a more acceptable and a really appealing and powerful language across a lot of our social justice communities. I think that we've had enough of the conversations that we do not mean the punitive system, and have acknowledged the mistakes we've made in the past, so that I think it's clearer that we are really looking at a different kind of notion of justice. So I've become more comfortable to use transformative justice as kind of an overarching politic. For some people, just really a way of life that we're trying to live and grapple with. What does it look like to practice and to believe in, to think and do transformative justice in our everyday lives? I know that's some of what we'll talk about today. So I'm going to, emphasize that kind of the overarching politic and the practice part of it, that it's all of those things, that we're trying to create responses to harm that do not replicate harm and are not continuing or furthering harm. And that is something that's not that easy to do, as we find in the real world, as we're trying to figure out what this looks like. It's something that does actually believe in transformation and change, even of those people who have done really heinous and horrible things to us, who have been harmful, and that those people sometimes are us. So those are some of the things that I just wanted to add to the definitions that I really am happy to hear about from YWAT. Thank you.
Thank you for talking about like the difference in the language between community accountability and transformative justice. I think we've like come to use them interchangeably. And they did, and I mean, we don't have to get into this because it's a whole can of worms, but they did evolve like not separately, but kind of simultaneously through different groups who were practicing things. And there was a synchronicity to it that was really interesting. And so they do actually have their own stories behind them that I don't know how important they are to get into, but I want to say that the way I've come to kind of think about community accountability is that it is transformative justice is a broader philosophy that has tons of interventions. There's tons of interventions for transformative justice. And I've come to think about community accountability as one of those possible interventions. And that can look like a process. It can look like all kinds of things, but it's become, for me, something that is a set of interventions inside the TJ philosophy. And that's kind of how it evolved in my head, but that's not that, like Mimi, you were saying, like there's no dictionary or like encyclopedia for us to like check which came first, like because so much of this was like in our heads and we were just evolving over time. So yeah.
I think synchronicity works for me. I do think I don't think having a little sound problem. Okay, I'll continue talking. I don't know if
Mimi, do you have the live stream playing? That might be causing an echo.
I am not even sure. I didn't change anything from what was happening.
You didn't change anything?
No, not at all.
Okay.
Is it going away?
I think it's a little bit better right now.
I'm sorry. All right, let me keep going and maybe I'll sit a little bit further from the mic. Can you hear me? All right.
That's better.
It was? Okay. There is a little bit of an echo, so sorry about that, folks. I hope that goes away. I think we were talking about, yeah, I wanted to echo, I guess I'm echoing, because I don't think that they developed in opposition to each other. I think it was more kind of a different political trajectory, but trajectories that were really interwoven at the same time. I know because I was working very closely with Generation 5 in the Bay Area. We were doing these projects together. They tended to use transformative justice. We tended to use community accountability. It was not a struggle or a fight in any way. I think it was more of a preference. And I think that I've very much believed in having a synchronicity of language and both figuring out when unifying principles and concepts and language are important, and when we really allow for a free flow and a variation depending on the community you feel attached to and accountable to, and depending on your local, where you're growing things locally. So I really like that interplay between both.
Yeah. And I think like one of the things that's important to me in terms of lifting up restorative justice, and we have like such great examples that we want to get to. And so we're kind of like we're trying to give you the quick and dirty so we are at least all on the same page with what we're talking about. And when we're thinking about restorative justice, the contrast between TJ and CA, that's my shorthand for transformative justice and community accountability, versus RJ, restorative justice, is that RJ, first of all, is like has a long lineage of so many hardcore Indigenous and BIPOC organizers who, like in Illinois, were responsible for overturning the death penalty here. So I think it's like incredibly important to honor and respect the lineage of RJ organizers. And RJ also has given so many interventions that in TJ we utilize all the time. And so like there's a real, again, synchronicity and symbiosis. The thing that happened was, and there's people more educated than me about when this went, but I feel like it was the 70s and 80s. We started losing RJ language to the state. And now that's how you have like restorative justice courts, and that's how you start having RJ in prisons. And so one of the things that like I like to think of is like there was RJ 1.0, which is like the OG RJ, and like the people who are like hardcore. And when we talk about restoration of a harm that happened, which is part of the definition of RJ, that we're restoring the people who were involved in a harm back to their original form, so that we're ameliorating or healing whatever went wrong between them. That we remember that the OG originators of RJ were talking about pre-colonization, like that was one of the main harms. And so RJ 1.0 was absolutely about challenging root causes, and one of those root causes being colonization. As RJ got co-opted, this is part of how TJ formed, was not so much as a response, but as to get more clarity, to make sure that we're clear that TJ has to happen outside the state. And at this point, RJ, we don't know what it means anymore because RJ 2.0 got really co-opted. What I love is the RJ, what I call RJ 3.0, which is like so many incredible restorative justice projects that really mirror 1.0, that are like the incredible project that Sonia Shah is a part of, and so many of the other amazing practitioners that we're really closely aligned with in TJ work, because this is where TJ and RJ really do merge, is in that 1.0, 3.0 version. And personally, I stay a little away from the language of restorative justice just because it's become so muddy. And what I think is we have to really be aware of how and when we're using transformative justice now, so that TJ doesn't go the way that RJ went. We don't want to have a 2.0 because we want everyone to understand that RJ happened, like that TJ has to happen outside the state. There is no version of it that can align with the state to remain TJ. I think you're on mute, Mimi.
Oh. I think somebody muted me because of the echo problem. I love the way you explained that, Shira, and I'd never heard an explanation in that way. It makes so much sense. I think I came into understanding RJ in some kind of version of 1.0, and also understanding the indigenous roots of RJ, and also now understanding that many indigenous First Nations people, you don't resonate at all with the language or the term restorative justice. It's simply the way that they've done the work. I don't want to speak for Indigenous folks, but I have been in spaces where the use or the label of restorative justice was really seen as very offensive. So just wanted to take away from those learnings. I think that I then just went on my own community accountability TJ way with a lot of other folks, including you, Shira, although I got to know you a little bit later. We know that people in Philadelphia were doing Philly Stands Up. Folks in Durham were doing Uhuru. And so there were different people that were doing this in different locations. And we were kind of getting to know each other and hear about each other, Safe Outside the System in New York, and found that we were growing our own kind of way of doing TJ. I think for me, I really didn't know RJ practitioners at the time. And it was something that I sought in terms of understanding that there was a whole history of practice that had been done and really wanting to learn about that. And it really wasn't until, honestly, more recently that I've made some more contact and went into RJ spaces that were actually so shockingly like, they were so systems oriented. They would have entire panels that were, middle-aged white men and didn't see that as problematic. This isn't so long ago. So I have, I very much understand that 2.0 went a whole different way. I've read some of the really early work by Howard Zehr, who said this should never go into systems. It was very, very clearly saying that in some of the earliest pieces among some of the white Mennonite people that were doing restorative justice in the United States. So I came in then really wanting to know about some of the methods that had been developed, many of which I think have informed TJ people and practices. Some that I'm actually learning from now. And, they're not uniform. There are all kinds of different ways of doing RJ as there are different ways of doing TJ. I think, I really appreciate the honor that you're giving to the lineage of restorative justice. I think sometimes I've been, because I've seen 2.0 becoming something that people will grab onto and start funding. And that looks like the alternative that everybody's talking about right now. And I know that so much of it just doesn't question its reliance on the criminal legal system, ties with law enforcement, that I have been, I know publicly, pretty strongly cautioning against restorative justice to the point where, I think I haven't had a chance to acknowledge the important work of people you mentioned, Sonia Shah, Sujata Baliga, and others who have really also been trying to move restorative justice, who are more embedded within restorative justice movements and who are really strongly trying to move them away from law enforcement and into the community.
Yeah, I think like maybe it makes sense to also get into some storytelling before we go to the other definitions. And so, like, do you want to talk about how, I think like what people need to know is that Mimi is one of the co-founders of Insight, Women of Color and Trans People of Color Against Violence. And what Insight created over 20 years ago at this point is what so many of us have been working with for these last 2 decades. And so I guess, I've always been curious about like what happened? Like what worlds collided that allowed, like, how did you even get to Insight? Like, you're one of the co-founders, like what was happening? The other, can I just say one fast thing before you answer too, is like one of the things that I've always like so greatly appreciated and admired about the co-founders of Insight is that everyone was an anti-violence activist and working within DVNSA. And that to me is such a big difference between kind of like what we're seeing now, which is awesome, where so many people are drawn to TJ from multiple fields and, from across like, whether you're just an activist on your block, not just whether you're an activist on your block or whether you're running a rape crisis hotline. And so I think it's like such an important thing to remember that this current wave of movement was founded by activist survivors working within anti-violence who were all queer and trans people of color.
So you're asking the origin story of Insight.
Yeah.
Well, according to we would, all of the people that were there at the beginning, probably a different memory and understanding. I do want to give credit to Andy Smith. She, that I know that there's a lot there. But she did know a lot of people that came together at the beginning. I had been working in the same organization in Chicago, being part of the anti-rape movement from the late 80s, and had different encounters. I remember Beth Ritchie coming as women of color in that movement in Chicago, and because you're from Chicago, so that was a really formative time for me. It was when I first entered the anti-violence movement, but also uh, very, very quickly came to deeply understand white racism within the movement, and organized together with across other people of color within the movement who, whatever critical mass had at that time, we reached a point when we decided that we really had to organize and have a bit of a revolt. At the time, that was really formative for me. It was formative to see the different kinds of concerns that we as people of color had that were very different than the white feminist movement. And and I also want to say that we also thought that the anti-violence movement and the sustaining of that movement was very important, but we were very tired of always being on the sidelines, always working as line staff, never being the leaders, just on a kind of very organizational level. But what that meant was that we weren't able to center the kinds of concerns and politics that we had to struggle to define for ourselves. We didn't all come with the exact same people of color politic. That is something that we develop and struggle. And I think that a few of us had already been kind of meeting in different spaces, whether they were, you meet in the bathroom, somebody's hotel room, right, at a conference, and start talking about what you wish you had, or what needed to happen, or doing your critique. I think that I talked to you kind of recently, I feel, about a national coalition against sexual assault conference I went, where the very struggle about naming sex work either as a form of work or as a form of victimization was a huge, I would say, battle. It was huge, and it was along the lines of race. I know it doesn't always fall that way in every place, in every space. It did then. And those were some of the struggles that I was walking into in the late 80s. So I had many, many years to be in conversation and build relationship with various people, that Beth Ritchie, other people that we now see as, many of whom have left the actual movement, some of whom have stuck around, and many of whom are responsible for saying, listen, we need to center something else. As you probably heard, the Insight conference, the founding conference in 2000, we really figured that a couple hundred people would come, and it just became like a place for us to gather and see if we could found something that was centered around communities of color. But when we saw that almost 2,000 people signed up, it was very clear that there was something else happening beyond the handful of us that were organizing that event. And you could absolutely feel the energy of that at that conference. It came 2 years after the Critical Resistance Conference, where I had a very similar experience. There was something different. This is the kind of the birth of a contemporary version of abolition, and the coming together with a feminist abolition feminism that we didn't have the name for at the time. And it had energy, it had potency. It was the right, had been the right time long ago, and it certainly didn't start in 2000. But there was a way in which we decided to create an organizational form that wasn't in the formation of a nonprofit, but that really sparked people's imagination and became so much more than those of us who are co-founders.
Yeah, thank you so much for that and for all of the work. One of the things I also loved about Insight's founding, and like rather than go too on and on about it, because there's lots of places to learn about it, through multiple anthologies, The Revolution Will Not Be Funded and The Color of Violence, and also through this incredible event that BCRW did for the 20th anniversary. Back in March, I think it was, or April or May. I lost my pandemic clock is not working. And so but like just also how anti-imperialist it was. Like it was so anti-state, and all the reach of the state was so critical, and linking like war to the anti-violence movement was so epic for me. And so, you know,
yeah, I just want to say the as you were saying, at that time, so much of what was happening, at least in the anti-violence movement, I think so many spaces, and it still can be. You know, you had your panel with an Asian person, a Latinx person, an African American person, maybe you had a Native American person. That was the recipe book that so many people were following in terms of what it meant to have people of color, anything, you know, inclusion, politics, and this really blasted those kinds of categories. Those categories just fell away, and you could see the complexity of the real world and the kinds of connections we're making, as you said, against imperialism across, you know, Palestine, South Africa, United States, Canada. You know, it was coming together of so much of that energy. But you know, I want to ask you also, Shira. I don't know. I know that you've been very much part of the Insight family and the events and the growing of the politics and practices. But I actually have a lot of questions about you and the importance of YWEP, Young Women's Empowerment Project, as a really just a unique, I wish it weren't as unique as it seems to still be, but critical formation in not only our imagination, but just in the concrete work that you've done. But I think there's different myths going around about Shira and your relationship to YWEP. So I would love to ask you to talk more about that story.
Oh, I mean, I'm sure don't put your myths in the comments because I don't even want to know. Some of the rumors I've heard about myself have been amazing. I'm like very impressed with my life in rumors. It's kind of great. And in real life, I like leave my house for an hour every day to walk the dog, and that's it. I guess like to go back to interventions though, like also like I guess one point I want to make is like part of why we're talking about the history of all of this. Well, there's two reasons in my mind. One is because we're so ahistorical, like we think everything is about now, like that defund is a movement that just started. It's a movement that galvanized beautifully and epically, but that we have actually been base building and doing this work through not only like building a really careful political analysis, but also through the interventions, which is the second reason why I think it's so important, is that the history of TJ is defined by our willingness to try and fail at interventions, and by the fact that we needed each other so much to survive and still do now. And that was actually part of like, so I didn't know I was doing TJ, and people probably have heard this story before because I share it somewhat often. And, like I was just a part of communities that couldn't call the police because we were using drugs or because we were involved in the sex trade, or even like when I was younger and sleeping outside a lot or squatting a lot. That isn't legal. It's not legal for young people to not live in their houses, to not live attached to like a parental body, whether it's a court appointed or the people who you were born to. And so like you had to kind of figure out how to solve problems. Mostly the problems we were experiencing were around like sexual violence, intimate partner violence, like, relationship violence. That's the word I use now, intimate partner violence, but that wasn't the word I used then. And, also theft was like an enormous part of problems we were constantly trying to solve. And like, in many ways, theft is so hard because it's like, if we didn't have money to replace the item collectively, then like that loss around theft is so painful and so real, especially when you're stealing from each other and you have so little resources to go around. And so we were always figuring out how to solve problems without the state because social workers didn't know what to do with us. And we actually could not go to the cops at all. It wasn't, I think a lot of times people would threaten to call 911 on each other as a form of retaliation. But honestly, it really happened very little in the immediate world I was in, because it was just ridiculous. Like, everyone was at such equal risk for harm in doing that. So that's kind of like the interventions that I was doing that I didn't call interventions. I called it protecting her back, or having her back, or like, we have to do something because so-and-so keeps taking people's shit, like, it was like this thing. And then when I joined Young Women's Empowerment Project, I joined it once it was founded by a group of people. I wasn't a part of founding it. And it was in 2001 that I started getting involved in Young Women's Empowerment Project. And we were a project that was at that time, we became a project that was all by and for, that was all BIPOC. But at the time, in the beginnings, in our early days, we did have Claudine O'Leary, who was white and like one of the most instrumental co-founders of YWEP. But we were all people who traded sex for money for survival. And we were all people who had some overlap with the street economy, either through trading sex for money or through buying or selling drugs. And so when I got more involved in YWEP, somewhere around, so I was involved from 2000, 2001. We became a nonprofit in 2002, and my involvement got more and more. And then when I became the co-director in 2005, 2006, I think. Mm-hmm. One of the things that we experienced that brought us to Insight, which we knew of Insight from the conference, but we didn't know Insight. We were we went to the one in Chicago because we're in Chicago. We went to the one in New Orleans because we got so lucky to go to that. And it was just two of us, and it was a conference. It was not we didn't really, we weren't a part of it. But what brought us to it, that was also an intervention, is that we experienced death threats as an organization. I experienced them specifically, but the organization experienced them as a whole for a couple of different reasons. We had cops and feds that were staking us out, trying to get at someone's partner. And then we had two different, one John targeting one of our outreach workers and another John targeting me. And it was all converging. And we had no idea what to do. We actually did call the cops because they were outside of our building. And so we were either tell us why you're outside of the building or do something about these death threats. Mm-hmm. And they were are they threatening your identity? Because otherwise it's not a crime. It's just telephone harassment. And we can't tell you why we're out there. We have no record of even being out there. And we're we're pretty sure we're surrounded. We have a record. And so we called Insight. Actually, I don't remember how I got connected, but Andrea Ritchie was the one who set up a phone call. And all of a sudden there were these 6 badass people, other women of color from all over the country, helping us figure out how to get out of our building, helping us figure out how to communicate with each other without cell phones, helping us figure out how to document what was happening and where to keep that documentation because they could take it from you. That's not legal. I learned that from Andrea. And we were, doing these interventions. And that was, then we were oh, this is a thing. This is called something, because we do stuff like this all the time. We're just not all usually targeted at once. And so we needed someone else to help us puzzle through how we were being targeted. But I think that one of the things that I get so excited about and I get really amped when we're talking about this stuff is remembering that TJ is built on interventions. Community accountability was built on people just trying shit. Right now we have so many workbooks, and we have we don't have so many. We have 2 or four that I can think of right now that are out right now that are so great. The CI Toolkit, Fumbling Towards Repair. There's another beautiful one that just got dropped, whose name I'm forgetting. And there's another one coming out. And then we also have so many trainings and so many like opportunities to sit and think about this. But what I'm dying to see is how that's going to spark interventions, because that's what this is. It's a practice. The politic got smoothed out and developed over time. And there are so many people who were so incredible at the analysis and making sure we all understood. But you have to be willing to try shit and fuck up because that's how we figured this out. And it wasn't professionalized. It wasn't like a place that you call for an intervention. It was something that we kept figuring out. And I think that so many of us keep doing it that way. And other people I think are afraid to jump in there and practice. Okay. And I think as much as possible, I'd love these stories of, maybe we could each tell a story of a failed intervention to help people get comfortable. My favorite thing is to talk about mistakes. I keep threatening to do this workshop called Every Mistake I've Ever Made, but the reason I can't do it is because it's like 3 days long. And so it's like, how do I pare it down? I haven't figured it out because my mistakes are pretty massive. And I think like if we can talk about like some failed interventions, maybe to help people realize what hasn't worked for us. And I think then we can talk about some ones we're seeing that are really working.
I'll let you do that part. Thank you. Yeah. Well, I'm going to actually start with a little bit of a story about how I started thinking about this too. And it's not necessarily mine, but well, yes, I will share one of the many. And that is, I think, coming out of 2000 and starting on Insight One, this became central, right? Talking about whatever we call them, I think community accountability at the time became a central part, something you could name as a central part of the work that some of us were doing, whether we were doing it as sideline, like we had a paid job and then we did this as our unpaid job, which pretty much most of us still at this point. But I remember going and talking about, I think we use the language of alternatives to criminalization. This is early 2000s. And people just like, what are you talking about? And then people just, 20 minutes in, we're like, oh, is it like my sister whose husband was beating on her, and then he wasn't going to let her come to a barbecue, and then basically they went after this man with garden tools. So they're like, is that what we're talking about? And then
garden tools.
Yeah. So these are the stories, right? So I just started hearing the stories that other people had once you gave them a little bit of time to think what would an alternative look like. They were like, oh, and then I remember somebody else saying, I remember some high school students who were friends with this girl, and they found out she was getting beaten by her father, and they went and confronted her father. And I was like, this is in the same kind of little gathering we had. I think it was an organizing space. And I was like, yeah, these are the stories. These are the stories of things, and it just brought up more questions around what happened. How did they decide to go talk to their girl's father? What happened? What did he say? Was she happy that they did that? Did she organize it? Did they do it without, all of those questions that I think then become really important in terms of how we're doing actual interventions, right? So that led to really kind of dreaming that wouldn't it be great if we could actually collect those stories and start documenting them and ask more about what happened, what did you learn from that? And of course, yes, I had my own stories, and a lot of this is fueled by things that happened in childhood as a young person. Like you wish, there was nobody to go to. You wished that people could have come around and actually supported those people that were doing harm, to be like, hey, listen, you got to stop doing this. And so a lot of it was just motivation from what I didn't have as a young person, and seemed like it was really possible to build that, but everything was pointing a different direction. Oh, call a therapist, call this, call the hotline. and, understanding that wouldn't have been helpful. Like, they wouldn't have gone. They never would have called them. They wouldn't have gone. They had other people to rely on, but we weren't doing anything to actually equip those people to say the right thing or do it or organize, because everything was against that. Everything was like feeding into this, nonprofit industrial complex that then further fed into the carceral system. So understanding that didn't work. I think that some of my, like, the urgency came also is in being involved in both anti-violence different formations, but also social justice formations in which there was continuous shit happening, continuous harm against more vulnerable people. There was continued stories about intimate partner violence and sexual violence, and seeing how inept we were at dealing with it and being called to deal with some of it. I remember one organization I was part of where it really turned out there was, a call out of intimate partner violence. And it brought up all of those things that we still see as problems even now, which is, I don't believe, not knowing who the actual person doing harm is, having differences of opinions. But also, I was part of what we called an A team, the accountability team, that was going to go and talk to the person who done harm. And, it's like, okay, I can do that. Going in and really telling this person they had to leave the organization. So that was like our idea of what was non-criminalizing. But we left this person with no support, with the shame, the shame of being kicked out of an organization, but without a support system to hold them through that and move towards accountability. So it was like, this is, there's kind of an investigation that happened. I go, this is the best we can do. How is this so much better than what we're saying we're trying to replace? And it really was that kind of fueled something that some people might be familiar with. The product that came out of it was the community accountability within people of color, progressive movements. I think something that came out of a meeting that some of us held in 2004, early 2004, to really bring together some stories that I'd been hearing about and that I had been part of, to see, like, what happened, what did we learn from this? What are the strategies that we can do? And, we were still kind of developing this practice of whatever we're calling community accountability or transformative justice. What needed to happen? What do we as a movement need to do that's different? So I think, there's more details to that particular story, but I found myself in this position of supposedly calling for accountability in some way, but really just having that equivalent to telling somebody to leave with, like, good luck, hope you have a great journey trying to figure out what accountability means. And, something that still happens now, right? But it really became so clear that we as a movement had so much more to offer in terms of really coming up with strategies that fit our vision of liberation, and that wasn't it. So, I see TJ very much as moving and developing and our capacity to imagine, but also to practice liberation, what we want to see as the world we want to live in. And every time I'm involved in something, those are the questions that come to mind. Do you want to? Well, I guess you shared some of the things that were happening that brought you to TJ. As that, oh, we're doing TJ? I had no idea.
Yeah, there were so many like interventions we were doing that we didn't know were called. I'll just name some of them. Like, we had our own food bank. We had our own syringe exchange. We had our own clothing exchange. We ran sister circles every week. We were part of something that we created called the Bad Encounter Line, which was a take on the bad date sheets that were started by Danzine in Portland, which was a group of people in the sex trade and street economy who were used to write down the names of bad Johns and describe them, like describe their car, describe their license plate, describe what they look like, and then sometimes mimeograph, if that's a word, and flyer, like, and literally hand them out and put them up in clubs so that people knew who a bad date was. And we started something called the Bad Encounter Line, which was the really cool TJ intervention that we came up with that then was used by We Charge Genocide here in Chicago when we were trying to hold police accountable. And then it's also being used in Seattle right now. And I can't remember what they retitled it. If anyone is in Seattle on the call, please drop it in the comments. I think it's called System Failure Alert. That's run by Emi Koyama. And so like what that was a way of collecting data when young people who were presumed to be in the sex trade and street economy tried to get help. We found that young people were turned away from help for being assumed to be in the street economy. And so, or being assumed to be in the sex trade, whether or not they actually were. And then we started documenting who was turning them away. And it was like neck and neck between hospitals and police, the number of people who were either directly, overtly harming young people, or who were just harming young people through neglect by like turning them away for services, or who were people would go in for like a stomach ache and wind up in psych, or, would call to make a report on someone who was hurting them and wind up arrested. And so we started tracking all of that and then sharing that data widely throughout the city. And that, that led to a campaign called Street Youth Rise Up, where we did so many incredible other interventions where like we learned how to taught by Stacey Ehrenberg and Tanuja Jagannath, how to like make our own herbs so that we could go to the doctor less often for the things that were bothering us the most. So that was headaches, that was pelvic pain, flu symptoms, and anxiety, depression. And so we learned how to press our own pills from herbs. Wow. And then we learned how to distribute them in our community safely. And so like those are beautiful TJ interventions, right? And then there's the ones I fucked up. I don't know, this isn't in Fumbling Towards Repair, but this is one of the ones that keeps me up at night the most. One time when I was a part of a organization where I'm going to anonymize as much as possible here to not tell another person's story. But basically, I was part of an intervention that I designed, where we all confronted someone at once. And so this was like this mafia style intervention, right? Where it was like, we're going to tell you every single way that you fucked us up. And we kind of did it first we did it one-on-one, and then we did it all in a circle in a group. And we gave the person no solutions. We gave the person we just told them every single way that they fucked up. And that person wasn't able to handle that. It was a 2-hour long or 3-hour long. There were 7 of us. It was horrible, right? And part of what was there's endless things that were a bad idea about it. One was that, that person had no support. There wasn't anyone who was just on their side. 2 was the sheer numbers, that's just not how I would ever do an intervention now. And that was maybe 17 or 18 years ago, but I remember it crisp, because I felt like I caused so much harm. And I've had a chance to make amends, and the way that I'm accountable now is by not only telling the story, but also teaching as much as possible, how stories like that can cause harm and lead to mistakes, and I think we all have those, and we can't, they feel terrible. It feels terrible to make a mistake like that in TJ. And if we weren't like trying so many interventions, we wouldn't have as much to keep us moving forward towards liberation. And if we stay in the spirit of generosity, which I hope that we can receive these stories and then people can improve on them. And so I think I would feel differently if I didn't have forgiveness and amends with that person. But since I do, like, I can appreciate it in hindsight differently. I want to like.
Can I ask you something about that story?
Yeah.
Because there's a way in which, echo problem again. There's a way in which those stories can also, especially we read about them or we see a movie, like they're all kind of satisfying still, right? It's like, oh, 7 young people went. I mean, I don't know who this person is who you confronted, but power, So I'm wondering, how did you feel at the time? Did it feel like a mistake at the time?
Oh yeah. It felt like a mistake at the time. Yeah, because I could see that person just collapsing, and not even able to process the feedback. They just were collapsing. And so I knew that we were doing the opposite of our goal. Like, our goal was thinking, if we air it all, we'll get transparency and transformation. And what really happened was that person just caved inward and felt so horrible about themselves that there was just, it was sad. It was, I knew at the time. I tried to dial it back because we were like, I don't remember what we like tried to get a hold of it, but the damage was done. It was too late. Yeah. But like, rather than heading out to the break, which we're going to head out to in about 10 minutes on sad stories, let's like talk about some of the incredible interventions we're seeing around us right now.
I'm just going to give evidence of incredible interventions. I have to say, I still, I'm a little bit in the land of challenge and difficulty. And there have been, what is really good? And there's still like a lot of naysayers about transformative justice because there still are a lot of failed, faulty interventions. I have been hearing of so many more that have gone well. There are things that they're small sometimes. They're things that they don't get lifted up. They're not in blogs. They're not in social media necessarily. Sometimes the really bad ones that are, where people actually did take the fundamental principles, I think, that we as a collective community have been developing over time and use that to inform kind of each part of how they approached an issue, approached a harm or a set of harms, and worked towards dealing with the person who had if there was an individual person identified as one who's done harm, in a way that did show some connection, care, and compassion, while also holding the absolute truth of what they did to cause harm. So I think that I'm not necessarily at liberty to share those individual stories at this moment. So I know they're very abstract sounding. I have been really heartened by hearing more about the work that has been happening in some of the more organized spaces. For example, Philly Stands Up, and hearing about the work that even though they now have disbanded, they have been so good at sharing the principles that they've carried, the long-term holding that they did in spaces with people who have done harm, like meeting with them every week or every other week for a year. And this is like political work. And really getting to the point, I think what really helped me to have a different, I think I started this being a little bit like, we have to come hard. We have to make demands. And I know that I have that as my beginning approach, and it didn't work very well. It's like people didn't want to show up. they came to one meeting and they were like, I don't want to go to that again. Or, you end up getting blamed for having, a witch hunt or a bullying kind of intervention. I mean, I think that's part of what organizing that people do. People who have caused harm do. So I'm not saying it was all the fault of those of us who try to do an intervention. But I think that it was really helpful for me to learn, for example, from Philly Stands Up, how they would initially talk to somebody, yes, absolutely holding them or dealing with accountability from day one, but also asking about their needs, food, shelter, job, income. And, some of the things I think that you were really raising in the work that you've done, Shira, but that really actually shifted me from what I think was still some kind of version of a kind of like, we're going to go in hard type of approach, as opposed to looking at this as kind of looking at holistic and liberatory needs for everybody. And that is something that is not only going to be in the benefit of supporting the interests of people who've done harm, and some people like have a problem with that. It feels like coddling, like, why are you paying so much attention to them? But actually is something that's going to reduce their capacity to continue doing harm. And in that way, that I see that as something that can benefit those people that were directly harmed, but also the larger community. And I think we have to get better at, I think we've been pretty good at talking about that, but I think we have to even get better at talking about that. Or perhaps that's just something that I have to get better at doing. So as I see those approaches being used more and more, I'm seeing and hearing about a lot more success. Sometimes I think some of the hard things that are happening are within organizational settings, and that those are often the people that seek me out, I know, for support. I think a lot of things that are happening that are hopeful are also within more family and community, chosen family, bio family, and folks that really feel like, actually, I can't afford to lose you as a human being that's in my life, my world. I don't want to hang out with you anymore. I mean, I want to be near you, but I'm not invested in your complete banishment from everything that's life giving, and I'm not interested in social death for you. So how are we going to do this? Yeah, what are you seeing?
I see stuff all the time that's working, and I want to like lift up API Chaya because they and I want to say we're going to take a break in 3 minutes, and so I want to tell this story quickly. And when we come back from the break, we're going to have your questions, and also we're going to talk for a hot second about abolition feminism and carceral feminism. And so I just want to encourage you to leave your questions in the comments in the next few minutes. So the API Chaya, just does so many beautiful interventions, and they've had a long history in the TJ movement that goes all the way back to the early 2000s, late 90s, like so many people on this call probably do, and like Mimi does. And, I think that what I see them do now, what I see them do in the last couple of years that was really brilliant was start this project within API Chaya. API Chaya, by the way, is a project that works within SADV and anti-trafficking. And so sexual assault, domestic violence, intimate partner violence, and trafficking. Sorry to use acronyms. I don't know why I do that. And so they started this project that was in line with their values around transformative justice, that because they were getting so many calls and requests for them to come in and do processes. And rather than doing that, they built their volunteer base that had always been a part of API Chaya, and they worked with their volunteer base doing training to teach them how to hold processes, so that we're doing like a capacity building technical like assistance learning model. And those people have mentors, so they're supported. And then the mentors are also supported by staff in the API Chaya. So it's like this 3-ring. The other thing they did that was so brilliant, that's working really beautifully too, is that they didn't call it transformative justice so that it couldn't be co-opted by the state. They called it community solutions. And so they kept community accountability language and transformative justice language away from the state. And so I just love the ways that we are keeping interventions going while not letting the state start owning our language.
Well, now that you brought that up, I also wanted to share this project that I'm working on, but should we take a break first, or do you think it makes sense to try to finish?
Yeah, share it. Can you do it in like 2 minutes and then we'll take the break?
No, I'll try.
Yeah.
Shira and I have been talking about this because there haven't been that many successful stories in terms of kind of or incorporation or programmatic innovation, these kind of cool things that actual domestic violence, sexual assault organizations have been able to do. And so I'm also working with a group of folks in Northern California that are trying to do something around, we're calling it a pilot project, and it's also called Community Restorative Justice Solutions. Again, I think it's using restorative justice, seeing how it applies to intimate partner violence and sexual violence, and absolutely does not use law enforcement. So we're really trying to see what it looks like to take the kinds of situations of violence where people actually do want to engage in some ways with the folks that are around them, even if it's their friends and family member, to create more safety, and not necessarily with the person who's done harm, but it could be with the person who's done harm, and looking at the ways and the methods that have been developed with restorative justice kind of circle-esque type processes can be used in that way. That actually helps people, supports them to build their own collective skills, prevents further violence, improves their way of communicating with each other, and all the beautiful things that I think that we've wanted to infuse into all of our different kinds of processes. So we're doing that. We're still in the earlier stages. It's not easy work, and it takes a lot of time, but I also find that to be really promising. And want to thank Sujata Baliga as being an important part of that project, Chelsea Miller, and a bunch of other folks. I think we're still in the learning stages, but I loved kind of thinking about how that compares with what you're doing at API Chaya, and I think it's a way. No, we don't call it transformative justice either, but it's definitely not law enforcement, and it's very much also kind of influenced and inspired by the work in transformative justice. And what I hope is that what we learn from it can also be used to just improve the way we do things in the non-state, non-system world.
Thank you. That's really exciting and awesome. And I've heard of little projects popping up like that. Like there's something going on in the Bay Area right now that's not quite an alternative to 911, but it's like a mental health crisis line that I don't want to publicize too much because I'm not sure where they're at in the stages of development. I'm also just want to point people to the CAT 911 models, just because they are online and really visible as a possible model. And there's a lot that we don't even realize are doing what, like we've just been, I think, building things for so long that I don't think we even realize how much we do have and how much we still need, which I think probably gets us into some of the questions that we're seeing now around doing things to scale and the tensions and dilemmas. But let's first take a break, and then I'm excited to come back and dive into people's questions. Okay. So let's take 5 minutes. So be ready to go at 4 or 25 after the hour.
25 after. Okay.
Yeah.
2 minutes, y'all. All right.
5 minutes.
Oh.
Hi, everybody. We're back. And before we get into people's questions, Mimi, you were going to share. We were going to do some quick definitions of abolition and carceral feminism. And here's what I want to say: we want to focus on some of your questions. So I want to provide these definitions because I think they're really critical, especially to people doing mainstream DV and essay work. So I want to share these. And I also want to say we're not going to get too drilled down into them because there's so many great resources for them. And so the first resource I want to point you to is an incredible website, also started by Mariame Kaba and a couple of other people, called transformharm.org. Another place you can go to for resources is just-practice.org, which has a mixtape on transformative justice that has over 15 hours of training audio webinars about all these different components of transformative justice, and including working with survivors and so many of the things that we're talking about now more in depth. And tomorrow there's actually a webinar being hosted by the Residence Network in combination with Washington State Coalition to End Domestic Violence that features Beth Ritchie, and it's on abolition feminism. I'll be a part of that webinar as well. So just to shout out those places to get more information, because we're gonna do these a little quickly, but I want to start with carceral feminism. Carceral feminism is something that people should be really familiar with, because what it is a strategy that the mainstream feminist movement has used to use criminalization and legislation to stop violence. And in doing that, it has grown prisons, and it has most of the time increased violence against women of color, trans people of color, queer people of color, and survivors. And so an example of this legislation that I could do an entire series on is around the anti-trafficking movement. The anti-trafficking movement was something that mainstream carceral feminists jumped onto like I've never seen, to try to increase the penalties for purchasing sex, removing a lot of the laws that are around the sex trade and street economy, increasing penalties all across the board around the sex trade and street economy. And in doing that, to target the people who were the offenders, they actually made the sex trade so much more unsafe for people involved, both people who are experiencing harm, for people who are being trafficked, and for people who were even not involved in the sex trade, but who were now experiencing being targeted in different ways. And so that's like a whole can of worms that in many cases, state sexual assault services had to sign on to the legislation because their licensing bodies were forcing them to do that. And so it's part of how it spread like wildfire so fast. We see example of legislation in SESTA and FOSTA, SESTA, FOSTA. And I encourage you to Google those if you haven't heard that acronym before, but it's things that essentially widened the carceral net that captured so many people in the sex trade under the guise of trying to interrupt violence. And so that's a big piece of how carceral feminism works, is saying that we need to increase penalties, increase criminalization, increase policing in order to stop violence. Do you want to take abolition feminism? Oh, you're muted.
Can somebody unmute me? Thank you. Yeah, I'm just going to add again, because we could give a whole series on carceral feminism for sure. And what's the point I was going to make? Oh, I was going to say that there's a way in which then also the movement early on had a lot of capacity to do, they were doing things that were like TJ all the time. Part of that was because law enforcement at the time actually didn't give a shit about domestic violence, for sure. But there was a way in which then also people doing domestic violence and sexual assault work and trafficking work felt like we can't take on things that are dangerous. We're not going to do anything with the person who does harm, because if we do, there's we're going to collude with them, we're going to increase our danger, and so like we're going to throw it all to law enforcement and just let them handle it. So it's kind of like this really taking away all kind of responsibility and capacity even to be able to do that intricate work around transforming harm, and just throwing it all over to law enforcement and having a whole set of beliefs that would support that and would say if you didn't do that, you were actually going to endanger people. So there's just so much that goes along with that. And so much that I see now that kind of has people hesitating to try something different. So in terms of abolition feminism, you know what's really interesting is when I was writing something like only a year ago, and I was trying to see who had written on abolition feminism, even though we were talking about it all the time, I couldn't find anything on Google Scholar. There was, I mean, they had maybe a couple things that people were going to speak about, but there was nothing. It's different now, just a year later. So I think, you know, we're going to see a book on abolition feminism coming out early next year, written by Beth Ritchie, Gina Dent, Angela Davis, and Erica Miners. So we're seeing a lot more coming out. I just looked, and this is one definition. Abolition feminism is a liberatory vision of a world free from all forms of violence, including gender violence and violence of police and prisons. That was a simple definition that's been up on the Insight website since we did our event in April. And I just want to offer that as really a very, very simple and very positive and liberation vision-based definition of abolition feminism. I know we'll end up having a lot more things that people will define as abolition feminism, probably in the webinar that's coming up tomorrow. But that's what I'm going to give as my definition.
Thanks, Mimi. Should we jump into some questions? Yes. Okay. Hey, Hope. You're muted, I think.
Hi, I'm just jumping in to let you know that you can find the questions in two different places. So you can find them in the chats, but that might be a little bit harder because you can also find everyone's chats in the chats. And then there's also a Google Doc, which I sent you an email link to, and I'm going to put into the chats now. So you can access that Google Doc if it's easier to see all of the questions right in one spot there.
That would be easier.
Okay, great. I'll send you that link right now.
Thank you. Okay, we're just getting to your questions. Oh boy.
Yeah. Is this the one where people are asked, the first one is people are asking for more written materials, breaking down?
Yeah, you don't have to address every question. You can just look at the ones that you want to address.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, I just want to turn people to the amazing documentation that's on the transformharm.org website. When you see it, you might be, it's almost intimidating. It's so much, but Mariame Kaba just went, you know, with other people, collected all the different handbooks and essays and toolkits that are around abolition, transformative justice, community accountability. And so you can find a lot of things there. I have to say there's not that much written on transformative justice. There's a lot more on restorative justice, but you will find more things. No, I wrote a couple things recently I guess I can send you the links to them later, and I think you can find them on the YouTube website. There are things that Mariame Kaba has written lately that have been in blogs and the New York Times and so on. So you will find some things that are written. I would say in terms of transformative justice, look at the blog post by Mia Mingus, which I think is really great. And this isn't written, but this is the mixtape series put out by Just Practice. Has like really amazing, probably 1 hour to 1.5 hour videos that are concentrating on certain aspects of this, where I think you will also find some really great material, and that's available to you as of a couple months ago. Shira, did you want to add anything to that?
No, that was a great list. In terms of like more writing about RJ versus TJ and the way I broke it down with like the 1.0, 2.0, that came out of a conversation that Sonia Shah and I had. I didn't write it down. So no, that isn't a handout. That's like my thought process and just how I think of it. I think there's lots of people who have been working in RJ and who are like hardcore anti-state and also really incredible activists who have written a lot more on RJ. There's something called, Mariame would know if you could drop it in the chat. Mariame, it's like the little book. Like there's this series, I think you can even, they're so easy to access. And there's like a little book on restorative justice that really helped me a lot in learning and understanding RJ. There's also just tons of writing too on the roots and origins of RJ. And there's lots of writings from Indigenous people that gets at what Mimi was talking about, where like RJ itself is almost a little bit of a co-opted term. And so like, really thinking hard and long about the depth of RJ as a whole. And that's part of where TJ can sometimes be a little neater, in that we have access to this language because most of us are here and talking about it. And so can be a little easier to clarify some of that. I saw questions about mainstream SA and DV orgs and their relationship to TJ. And this is something that Mariame and Mimi and I talk about constantly. And let's just talk about it. Like the question specifically is like, how can groups be involved without co-opting? And then I think there's also questions about how can they do it, period, in mainstream DV and SA. And I gave a little bit of an example I gave a really good example using API Chaya because they are a mainstream DV SA org working on anti-trafficking, intimate partner violence, domestic violence, and sexual assault. And they have a beautiful program that is easily accessible online. And, I think some of the secret ingredients are that you do not call it TJ so that it won't get co-opted, and that you have people and an organization who has made a real true move away from using the state as the primary method of intervention. I want to also just say, because I've been saying this a lot lately, is I personally think one of the best ways that mainstream DV and SA orgs can begin to utilize transformative justice is by being accountable themselves to the enormous amount of harm that they've caused through using carceral strategies and tactics for so long. And I think it's really important that before we ask how we start a program, we ask what our role in it has been and how we can begin to address the harm that we have caused in communities that we've been trying to remain in alignment with and be in solidarity with. And even asking yourselves, have we really been in solidarity? And I think those, for me, that's the first place to start. And we do that in TJ too. Like if you come to learn how to do a process at a just practice training, you have to sit with how you want to be accountable as well. Because any TJ or CA process means that you as the facilitator are going to make mistakes. And so if you can't sit with your own accountability, you really can't begin a process or a program. And so I would turn it back to DV and SA orgs and invite you into the TJSA world through reflection, contemplation, and making amends for the over-reliance on the carceral system before we start any programs or even start really talking about what that looks like.
Yeah, I have, I've felt so many different ways about this, and partly because I'm somebody who has, my history was coming into TJ and community accountability from being embedded within the anti-violence world. And so I have a longer history in that. I have gone through many phases of complete rejection, which is a thing. And if you care about that, then, you know, I'm sorry for you, because we're not going to do any social change without having a lot of resistance and rejection and more. So I've been through that, and then I saw this kind of change come around maybe about 2015 or so, when there were more organizations. I think, Shira, they were reaching out to you, they're reaching out to me to come speak at some kind of gathering. And I've had hope about it. I've kind of gone through another period where I saw that interest just lead to almost no change. So I feel so many different ways about it. I think let's face it, we all know that our world has changed considerably just in the last year, and certainly since June, with defund the police and kind of a reckoning across all kinds of spaces and places, including the anti-violence movement that is still primarily run by white people, that has opened up a different kind of possibility. So I think it's a possibility that has probably a short frame in terms of a portal or an opportunity to do something, to jump through. And it's one that we haven't been in before. So I think we're like constantly having conversations about where are those opportunities? What does this mean? I want to point people to a document, for example, that came out in June of 2020 that was in response to all of the protests and the movement starting the end of May, but something that had probably been a long time in coming, and it's called Moment of Truth. This is one of the documents that I had a link to in the piece that I sent you before we started. So this is one of those documents that goes through some of the things that you were talking about, Shira, you know, that we fail to listen to Black feminist liberationists. There's an accounting that happened. The thing with a statement like this, it got signed on, I believe, by, if not almost all of the coalitions, the state coalitions that domestic violence, sexual assault across the country. That is organizing. It's a community organizing process to try to get people to sign on. My guess is there wasn't uniform, love for this document. There was probably a lot of struggle around it. And also, once this document's signed, what does it mean in terms of actual change and action? That's what we have to see. And that is something that sometimes I have to step away from, because I don't want to consume some of my time and energy so that I can't do the work out in the community and do in autonomous spaces. So if I only did that, I would not have the energy to do the other work, which ultimately I think is the most important. I think that, especially since I haven't seen, I've had different periods where I put more time and energy into the anti-violence movement and haven't necessarily had a lot of results. I think what Shira mentioned in terms of API Chaya, the project that I am putting time into with this Restorative Justice pilot project, these are attempts to look at particular local conditions that are available within a set of domestic violence, sexual assault organizations that seem to have some readiness to actually do the work. They've actually have had the organizational commitment to not necessarily overturn every single thing that they're doing that might be tied with carceral practices, but to actually see what it means to carve out a part of their organization to very intentionally do this work that might have further implications for the kind of work that they're doing that is more conventional, carceral, for lack of a better term right now. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that's an area of promise. What are those conditions? What are the kinds of programmatic shifts that organizations are able to make? How do those lead to further shedding or dismantling of other practices that they no longer feel like they want to support? And these are all things that are happening in very small spaces, but more spaces. And they're things that I think some of us who have been doing TJ work for a long time have been pretty selective about joining in. I'm sure Shira gets I get a lot of requests. I've had some that feel a little bit more authentic, honestly, recently. And I'm willing to do a little bit more work to see where it goes, just because they might be areas of promise. I think that what anti-violence organizations need to do is look very seriously at the policies that they've been, it's been wholesale support for and pushing for greater criminalization. That's just been the history of the movement for the last 30, 40 years. That has to stop. And there are some coalitions that have stopped that. I've seen that. And I think they're in a process of working with other coalitions to tell them what to do, or to instruct or give some guidance. That doesn't have to be anything that Shira or I need to spend a lot of time doing, or other people that we know. We also see backlash. So there's another link that I sent with, some of you may have seen this, an organization in northern Wisconsin that put out signs very clearly showing their support for Black Lives Matter at all of their sites, had enormous backlash, had the local police say, we're not going to have anything to do with your program, we're not going to support you, we're not going to be there if you ever need us, we're not going to send any survivors your way. People dropped off their board, they lost money. And this is another, this is what we're also seeing is that, and I'm sure what a lot of organizations have feared, is we have very pronounced, very concrete, very material kind of backlash happening against all of us. But I think for organizations that have had an entire history of really being in collaboration with law enforcement, this is something that they're like, wow, this is different. We see some backlash in terms of a KKK response to some anti-violence organizations that are trying to come out for defund the police and other kinds of Black Lives Matter support. So this is another thing that I think that people understood. It's something that the anti-violence movement does not have a history dealing with, or not a recent history, because they've gone along with carceral politics for so long. I think the early people that were early organizers did deal with this, and they just saw that as part of the work. But as it's gotten more professionalized and more completely tied in with carceral systems, there's no muscle there. And there's an increased hiring of people that fall into that line. They're not hiring organizers. They're not training organizers. They're not training people that are going to challenge the system. So when there's such a big gap, what does it look like right now? I mean, I'm interested in engaging in that. And I know that there are people listening to this and other webinars who are really interested in are within the anti-violence organizations. Some of you are getting driven out. I know that. Some of you might be in positions of power, or you can organize together to try to do something that pushes back. And as Shira said, we didn't have a toolkit when we started this. There was no toolkit, there was no webinar. We had our principles, and we had a little practice just trying to do something. And that's what some of y'all are going to have to do right now.
I want to add a couple things that I think groups can work on, maybe with a little less fear of reprisal, which would be mandated reporting, for example. I mean, self-accountability is my dream. If we started seeing the letter that Nan Stoops and others organized that had the moment of truth with 47 accountable organizations, if we started seeing that as a mass movement, I can't imagine what that would be like for us and how much closer we would be. But I think that the other points that we can work towards is really rethinking mandated reporting in your states. And from start to finish, how mandated reporting interrupts our ability to actually respond to survivors and children who are being harmed through non-carceral systems and through non-carceral means. And so it's difficult to think of it in a national way because states are so different. But we have states now that are working for, if they haven't already achieved, where everyone can be a mandated reporter. There was a bill that, thank God, did not pass in Chicago, in Illinois, that was trying to make hairdressers mandated reporters. And mandated reporting is fraught. It is a carceral response. Even though we need something to replace it, think tanks, if we could start seeing think tanks popping up around mandated reporting, and if we could start seeing mainstream SA and DV orgs challenging the expansion of mandated reporting, that would make a big difference. I think the other place that mainstream SA and DV orgs can do some real thinking and action around is in, everyone loves to talk about intersectionality, but if we can really think about intersectionality and the way in which survivors are, for example, impacted by the war on drugs. And so how many times survivors are turned away from social services or kicked out of social services for using drugs and alcohol, when in reality, drugs and alcohol may be the only thing that's keeping them alive right then, right? But we're kicking people out constantly. That's a carceral response. The drug war has been one of the largest fuelers of building prisons alongside DV. I feel like, if I were a different kind of thinker and writer and researcher, the nightmare interlocking between the war on drugs and the mainstream domestic violence movement has really produced, I think, some of the primary swells in prisons that we've seen in the last 30 years, 40 years, because they also really gain momentum simultaneously. Mimi does this awesome presentation that maps it in DV, and there's so much that maps the war on drugs contribution to the prison industrial complex growth. And the interlocking of these two things is alive in your sites, in your settings. Like how those two dovetail together is really just something. If DV and SA orgs started standing up against the war on drugs, what a game changer that would be, in terms of moving away from carceral systems and decreasing our dependence on the state. There's more too. I mean, we could go on, like immigration laws that, there's just so many ways that I think DV and SA could really put into action the things it says it does. Because the honest truth is individual workers, and I know some of you on this call, we've been using harm reduction in DV and SA. We've been using transformative justice in DV-SA since the get. Whether we write it on our files is another story. But we know how hard it is to work with people using the limited tools we're given. So some funding requirements even prevent us from working with people who've caused harm in the first place. So how can we really talk about TJ in these ways? And I think there's lots of other angles to come in at that we can really get on board.
Thank you. And I want to thank Shira for being such an optimist. I'm like looking at my comments from my friends in between time. But I'm going to give you 5 points that are made in this moment of truth piece. Because there was some thinking about what, this was drawn up by people that have been very much embedded in the anti-violence movement. And they said, reframe the idea of public safety, remove police from schools, decriminalize survival, provide safe housing for everyone, invest in care, not cops. I mean, those are just some 5 simple things that have policy and practice implications, some of which they draw out in that piece. So I think that it gives, it's not a starting point, but it's a point at which I think there has been some serious reflection among people that have been very much a part of the conventional anti-violence movement, but who have spent some time. I mean, this didn't just come out of nowhere in June. They have been spending some time really looking at what kinds of changes need to be made, what kind of amends need to be made, as Shira said. And what I'm hoping comes out of this is more and more examples. And we each gave you a couple of programmatic examples that I do feel really hopeful about. And I think that they will also then inspire more programs, I'm hoping, to think, how could we do something? Maybe it's not exactly that, but we can break away. We can actually make new changes in terms of the way in which we engage with criminal legal policy, and make changes in some of these very, very important policy arenas like mandatory arrest and mandatory reporting. So I'm hoping that with this energy that I see right now, that these breakthroughs will come at a faster pace. I know that, for example, restorative justice was against the law in Vermont because anti-violence people had put that in place. You could not use it for domestic violence. It was against the law. They worked to change that. It's no longer against the law. And in fact, they pushed to make it no longer against the law. And I think they're organizing to figure out how that can actually start being implemented within that state. So we are seeing these kinds of shifts happening in various locations. Wow. I think we're getting close to the end.
We're right at the end now. And so I feel like maybe we could just do a quick closing thought. Do you want to do a closing thought real fast?
Oh, you want to start?
Sure. I'll just say Mimi was joking that I'm an optimist, and that doesn't resonate for me, but as Mariame says, hope is a discipline. And I do know that some of the most radical people I know are in the anti-violence movement and are the ones who have been pushing back against carcerality forever. And that these interventions have belonged to us forever because we've always been solving problems without the state. And so I think that the more we can do to reclaim our imaginations, and the more we can take it back from grants, the more we can take it back from the state, the proof is in this call. The proof is in the defund movement. The proof is where we've gotten to right now, that so much is possible. And so I don't know if I'm an optimist as much as I believe in solutions, and I believe in the power of collective solution making. And I think that's what we are all doing here today. So thank you.
Absolutely. And if I weren't an optimist, I would not be sitting here 20 years after the beginning of Insight, because I know that not only is liberation possible, but it's absolutely necessary. And there's no opting out. You know, we might do it in different arenas, but this is the work we need to do in our personal lives, in our social lives, in our political lives. And we can see amazing changes that have happened just in this last few months, things that we didn't even imagine possible, at least not in our timeline. So everybody has work to do. We will continue these conversations, more webinars coming up. I'm going to see you tomorrow, but I'll be in the audience, Shira. It was lovely being with you today.
Thank you so much, Mimi. Thank you, Project Nia. Thank you, Hope. Thank you, interpreters.
Absolutely.
Thank you, BCRW. Thank you, Mariame.
Thank you, Shira and Mimi. That was so amazing. Thanks so much for being here today and for sharing all this wisdom. For folks who are watching, we'll be adding links to the event page of the many resources that were listed during the course of this conversation. And this video will stay live on the YouTube page where it is now. So you can go back and rewatch parts of it. Thank you again, Shira and Mimi, for everything. And thank you, Brandon and Carly and Sarah for captioning and interpreting.
Wow.
Bye.